these professional development sessions are doing exactly what we intended, which was to bring together all of you amazing people and sharing our ideas and passion. Now, of course, this is a webinar. There's lots of people here. I'd love to have lots of interaction and those kind of things, but because of the numbers, we just have to keep it fairly passive. Let's get stuck into it. So our overview for today, we've got a few things to cover. And the first of which is defining, just getting a picture in our mind of what we mean by e-learning. And then we're going to, I will get a bit of interaction. I'd love to hear from you about your experiences when you've been an e-learner. And that's, I think, a really good, something really valuable that we can learn from. So to reflect on our own experiences. We have a section on setting rules and protocols for e-learning and the importance of that, setting expectations, designing your course based on science. So we're going to do a bit of a recap on some of the sciencey stuff that we've talked about on how people learn and bring that into the context of e-learning. I'll share with you a template and a couple of strategies for actually designing and planning out your course. A bit of an exploration of tech skills. So what skills does the e-learning designer need to have? And then we're going to look at the strategies we can use for monitor, reviewing and evaluating e-learning, because that's a really important part of it. We get very excited about all the design and all the tools and everything else. And sometimes we forget to actually go back and use the dipstick and measure our course and figure out how it went and what we might need to improve. And tons of resources. As always, we're going to share with you heaps of stuff to use as a template, links to lots of really good resources. So hopefully that's of value as well. And I just had to be really clear on the fact that this session is not, when we talk about e-learning, and you'll probably find this yourself if you're having any staff room discussions, it's very easy to descend into well, not descend, there is a valuable discussion, but to get into a discussion about, what's the best tool? And I like to use Zoom, and no, I don't use Zoom, I use Teams, and I use Kahoot, and I use Quizlet, and all the different tools and things like that. So that kind of discussion can go on for hours and hours and hours and hours. So I'll give you a resource that might help you with that. And maybe that's a session for another day, is what, a list of different tools that we can use for e-learning. So we're not going to talk about the tech specifics and the tools and software. There's plenty of wonderful things out there. And of course, yes, thanks, Ben, you're into it already. Ben's an advocate for Zoom. And also we're not going to get too much into how to facilitate, like what's the best way to, present on camera in a Zoom session, or how do you facilitate your live sessions and all those kind of things. So we're just going to stay in the realms of designing and some of the kind of, I guess, more basic things. All right, let's get into it with a definition of what is e-learning. Well, the definition really is probably a whole ton of definitions out there, but really it's learning that is facilitated electronically. So if you really think about what that might mean, it has a number of definitions. And I know the world really got talking about e-learning in 2020 for obvious reasons. The world changed dramatically in that year. And so a lot of people got into e-learning who weren't into it previously, both educators and students. But if you weren't aware of it before then, it's actually been happening for a very long time. And not just in the internet era. In fact, one of my first gigs when I was at university, I used to develop floppy disk and CD-ROM based courses. And we had some pretty old technology there, but it was all about computer-based learning. And so you'd basically give the learners a floppy disk or a CD-ROM, which had the information on it, and they loaded it up and it started a program and they learned. So it wasn't, there was no internet there, but it was still e-learning. It was still learning that was facilitated electronically. But regardless of what kind of definition we get into here, the emphasis is on the learning part of e-learning. And that is important because that's about the people. And the thing to remember with e-learning is it's actually, while the means, the delivery method is different, the learning is not. You know, if we set a learning outcome, what we want from the people that are doing the learning is to make a change, to develop the skills, to develop the knowledge, to develop the attitudes. And so that doesn't change, whether that's in the classroom or as part of an e-learning course. And so if we make sure that we shift our thinking into more about what's happening for our learners in the individual, then we can go a lot further. It's very easy to get distracted with the technology, to get distracted in what e-learning is good for and what it may not be so good for. So, you know, we can have very, very rudimentary e-learning. You know, if you send out a CD-ROM or a USB stick with a PDF document and a Word document on it, that's e-learning. So that'd be on one end of the spectrum of very low-tech e-learning. But there's also e-learning on the very high-tech spectrum. So you might be thinking of the kind of courses you run, but I'd love to share with you this experience I had many years ago now, where we did a course with the Navy, and I got to go and play in the Seahawk helicopter simulator. And it was a wonderful experience because it's technically e-learning, and the technology, apparently the system, you know, this thing is up on hydraulics, it's in a pod, and it's fully 3D, fully immersive, and the cockpit is exactly like the real helicopter. And you know, you can feel the thing vibrating and everything else, and it's so immersive. And I was trying to fly the helicopter, and I overcorrected, and we started to feel the aircraft dropping out of the sky, and it was utterly terrifying. I had a pilot next to me. He was able to correct the aircraft, and we didn't crash the simulator. But the feeling of actually, you know, that I was actually falling out of the sky was really something else. So that's just to kind of give you an idea of what's on the other end of the spectrum as well. So we kind of really going from CD-ROMs and USB sticks with PDF documents all the way through to simulators. And apparently this Seahawk thing is just as expensive as the real helicopter. So just thought I'd share that anecdote. So anywhere between those two spectrums, we might exist with e-learning. You might have heard these, sorry, we're going to look here at the picture here, I guess, of e-learning, the big picture of all the bits and pieces. There's lots of moving parts, and this can help us orientate ourselves into where we might fit. And I guess, getting across some terminology here. So we have learners, you might call them students, participants, apprentices, trainees. I think they're always at the top there. They're really important in this picture. And they will access a course using either facilitation and communication tools like email and phone and Zoom. And it will often be all brought together in a thing called an LMS, which is a learning management system. Sometimes that plugs into another system called the student management system. So the difference between a student management system and the learning management system is the learning management system is there to manage the learning. So that tracks their progress through course objectives, you know, manages all the quizzes and the contents and the activities and assignments. The student management system is more about managing the students, their enrollment and their data and that kind of thing. We have the facilitators. So probably many of you are playing that role of using these tools to connect with the learners. So you can see the line there going between you on one side and the learners on the other side. So you're using the LMS and you're using those facilitation and communication tools to connect with the learner. Over on the other side there, we've got the authoring tools and instructional designer. And so I think today's session kind of plays in the realm of instructional designer and a little bit of facilitator. And in this instance, most of us, or many of us, we kind of do both roles. We usually design a course and then we go off and deliver it. Or sometimes we take someone else's course they've designed and we improve it and we go off and deliver it. In any case, even if we're just a facilitator, there's a lot we can learn from going back and looking at the role of the instructional designer. And the instructional designer is a term that is given to someone who's basically the person who comes up with all of the structure of the course, the design of the instruction, the design of the learning, what students are going to learn first, what they learn next, how they're assessed, how you measure the learning, the whole thing. Now, instructional designers, you can see there's a connection between them and the LMS. And there's two connections. There's a direct connection and there's one through another thing called an authoring tool. So that's another piece of terminology that you might hear in the e-learning space. So an authoring tool is not necessarily a learning management system. Authoring tools are things like Adobe Captivate, and it's almost like a fancy PowerPoint, where and PowerPoint, I guess, is a rudimentary authoring tool as well. This is the tools that we use to create the actual content that we might use to deliver a lesson. And sometimes learning management systems have authoring tools built into them. So we won't get too caught up on this stuff, but I just wanted to kind of orientate ourselves in the big picture of things and look at some very fundamental terminology that you'll see in the space of e-learning. Here are two terms that are very commonly referred to in e-learning as well: synchronous versus asynchronous learning. So what we're doing right now is, what is it, synchronous or asynchronous, for those in the know? Is this synchronous or asynchronous learning? Yep, it's synchronous. Thank you to those who've added in the chat there. Yes. So synchronous means learning and facilitation in real time. So webinar, video conference, live chat, something that's basically happening right there and then. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we kind of look at it as like a spectrum or a continuum. On the other end of it is asynchronous. And that's where we're not really worried too much about the constraints of time and place. And they're things like discussion forums, getting your students to watch a video in their own time, review a PDF, reviewing a web page, answering quizzes. So there's the two ends of the spectrum. We can actually make this picture a little bit more multi-dimensional. So this is something that was put together by Daniel Stanford, and he kind of designed this way of looking at the difference between synchronous and asynchronous and the continuum of those things. And also the up and down axis is high bandwidth and low bandwidth. So by high bandwidth, we mean things that, you need a good solid internet connection to do. So you can see up the top there, you'll see things like video. So pre-recorded video, asynchronous discussions with videos, and right over on the right-hand side, video conferences. On the low bandwidth side of things, you see things like text and email. And on the right-hand side, you'll see high immediacy. So that's on the synchronous end of the spectrum. And on the left-hand side, low immediacy. So that's the asynchronous side of things, when we don't really need to be in the same time and place. So you can use this model to kind of plot some of the different tools and tactics that you might use when you're designing an e-learning course. For example, on the right-hand side, if you were looking at things that were very synchronous, meaning everyone has to be in the right place at the right time, then you might see things like video conferences, webinar like this, audio conferences, phone calls, group chat and messaging. And then if you were looking at something that was low immediacy or asynchronous, that would be getting your students to watch a video or getting them to read the learner guide or the PDF document. Now, I'd like to hear from you. So in the chat, what I want you to do is give some examples. And I won't be able to get to everyone because it's going to get very busy in the chat, I can imagine right now. We're going to talk about your experiences. So think about the times when you've been a student, an e-learning student in a course, And I want you to tell me the things that you loved about that experience and some things that you loathed about that experience. And we can learn a lot from this. You need to put yourself in your own learner's shoes, and this will help. So let's have a look. I'll pick and choose a few things. People love well-structured content, being able to download the learner guides, interactive quizzes. Thanks, Peter. Being at home in their comfort of their own home is good. Thanks, Nahida. Okay, distractions has been raised here. Yes. Madonna talks about demonstrations. That's good. I think I quickly saw death by PowerPoint go up there. Yes. There's a lot to be said in the defense of PowerPoint. It can be a good tool, but it can be used very, very poorly to cause the old death by PowerPoint. A lack of communication there. Audio and video dropouts can be a challenge, you know, connectivity, accessibility, those sorts of things. Okay, flexibility has been mentioned a couple of times, you know, working around kids and home. Okay, lack of networking, lack of social networking. Thank you. Good one, Candice. I saw it. Lack of scaffolding. That's fantastic. So you might like to elaborate on that in the chat, but scaffolding is a really important thing. And sometimes it gets lost in e-learning. We forget that learners start from a point where they may not have the skills and knowledge and confidence to do the things that we want them to do. And so we need to increase the support. But as they gain the confidence and gain the skills, eventually we take those supports away and let them start practicing on their own time. Sometimes e-learning just chucks them in the deep end and there's no support. Oh, I saw one interesting. I'll just get to, okay. Madonna's said the two co-facilitators helps with the dynamics of an e-learning course. I agree. I love co-facilitating, especially in e-learning. Vincent talks about the lack of human connection. Sorry, I can't get to all of these. So many great suggestions here. Yeah, no proper, thanks, Debbie. No proper guidance and supervision of the session. Complex instructions. Okay, really good stuff. So if you want to get some ideas and inspiration of what to do, good practice, and what to avoid, what poor practice to avoid, go back through the chat and have a look. Now, we've actually, I've asked this question a lot of times from people, and people have gone into a lot of detail. And so I won't go through all of them now because this is pretty much what you've already said. I think you really addressed this one nicely. But this is a quick summary of all the times I've asked this question of different people over the years. This is a kind of summary of the most common points. Things like flexibility, studying at own pace and time, access to the course materials, interactive and engaging, good explanations, clear and concise, access to additional resources, support's often mentioned. You know, the support is probably the most commonly mentioned thing. Clear and well presented material. So there's some things that you can, we won't go into detail of these things. You have a look on the slides. I'm going to provide everyone with the slides and of course the recording. So you can come back and you can look at these in more detail and have a look also at the chat transcript as well when you get a chance. And also some commonly loathed things are boring presentations, not engaging, lack of opportunities for questions and clarifying, access challenges, excessive text, lack of interactivity, lack of clear instructions, disorganized, insufficient support, and quite clearly all the opposite things that have been talked about there as well. So the good things, I mean. So there's some things to avoid. I think it's good, you know, sometimes when we're designing these things, we forget what it's like to be a student. You know, we're now the teacher and we're getting caught up in playing with our shiny new materials and resources and the latest software for this, and it's lots of fun and we think the students are going to have a really great time, and we forget that maybe some really fundamental things of what's it going to be like when the student logs in here, and what's the first thing they see, what's the first thing they experience. When you're designing an e-learning course, it's important to talk about protocols. to make sure that when, it's very, very easy to get caught up in all of the content, designing the lessons and the assessment tasks and your quizzes and all those kinds of things. We forget about what the students might see first of all, like the protocols, the rules of the game. See, you don't mind playing, when you might be playing with your kids, having a bit of a game, and suddenly they change the rules halfway through, and you think, gee, that's not fair. That's not part of the rules. You're changing the rules. So if everyone is really clear on the rules of the game, then we'll all play and we'll all have a great time. And so it's kind of like that with our students. So here's a pretty exhaustive list. I don't really want to go into it. You can review it in the slides, but these are a pretty common list of things that you might like to get clear with the students before you start an e-learning course. And you can communicate these things in many different ways. You can have videos on it. You could have like a learner handbook. You can have a page in the course. It might even be a little quiz that you get people to check off that they do understand these things. Some of them are really important. And sometimes you look at these things and go, oh yeah, of course, it probably goes without saying. But it's not until you have an incident in a course where, maybe someone in a course has been a little bit inappropriate with another student. And that can sometimes happen. Sometimes people get a bit creepy on the internet when they're lacking the face-to-face content. And it's especially if you've got interaction between students in a course. And so if you've set this up from the outset and you do have an incident, you can actually go to the student and say, hey, this is the set of rules that we agreed to. What you've done here is actually in violation of those rules. And then you can follow whatever your organization's processes are for dealing with that. It can also be really good for use with, if there's a plagiarism or cheating. It can get really clear on, so students know exactly how to get help when they need to. And so you're not constantly answering these questions or making these things up as you go along. So they can be really useful. Now, if you want to kind of boil it down, I made this really dorky acronym that can be useful, as if we don't have enough acronyms in VET, but anyway, bear with me. I made this acronym that can be helpful in just getting you to remember the key things to consider when you're setting the rules for a course. And the acronym is E-class. So it's basically E for expectations. So set the expectations really clearly. What expectations you have of behavior, the expectations of interaction and communication, timeframes, whatever they might be. Talk about communication. So communicate with your students to set the expectations, provide information about the course, cover the learning objectives. That's always really clear so we know where we're going. The assessment. So what are the assessment requirements? Everyone's thinking about that when they start a course. They go, what am I going to be assessed on? What's the end result here? Support. How do I get help if I need it? And what's the schedule? When do I need to show up? When do I need to submit things by? How much time per week should I study if it's over a longer course? So maybe this thing, E-class, might help you think of some really a basic way of putting forward your rules of the game for your e-learning course. Now, on to designing your course. This is going back to real TAE basics, isn't it? And the reason is that e-learning is no different from designing any other types of learning. But there's 3 simple questions you can ask yourself that will set you in the right direction when designing a course. Who are your learners? What are the objectives that you want the learners to achieve? And the really important one for today's session is how will they achieve those objectives? By answering that, we can start to talk about the delivery methods. And you might even then start to get into the discussions about the tools and technology you use, or whether you're going to do Zoom sessions, live sessions, or videos, or whatever else. So that will lead you to that, to start to answer that question of how do they achieve those objectives. And so now we'll look at maybe some things around that third question. So you can answer the first 2 about who your learners are and what the objectives are. For many of us in VET, the objectives will be based on a unit of competency. So the real discussion is how do we achieve those objectives? I think it's really important here to have a discussion about the science of learning. You know, if you want to delve into this deeper, we had a couple of sessions on this over the last couple of years in this community, where we went into detail about the science of learning. And I think it's really important to look at these sorts of things, the peer-reviewed science. So the stuff that's actually been researched and tested to see if it actually works. Because in learning, there's a lot of folklore, there's a lot of things that are kind of thrown around that people just believe without really wondering if it actually works. And so things like retrieval practice, spaced practice, and varied practice, which are all common terms in the common names for the science, some sciences behind learning or some theories behind learning that have been tested and proven to work, can be really helpful. So let's dig into these, or there's other ones as well. And if you want to dig into, look at the previous session, but these are the really, I think, are really key ones, are really important for e-learning, especially. In e-learning, because of the issues around student engagement, you can sometimes lose these things entirely. You lose the opportunity for these kind of practice things with your students because they're not actually showing up for the course. So that's how important these things are. So let's look at retrieval practice. So this is based on something that Ebbinghaus in the 1800s, late in 1880, came up with this idea of a forgetting curve, which is basically you learn something and then over time you very quickly forget it. This is, the picture here is not scientific, but it's more of a representational thing. So let's say you participate in a webinar or a training session, or you do a module in an online course or whatever it is, and you learn something. You go, wow, this is great. You know, you're pumped, you're really excited about that thing. But it's amazing how quickly the forgetting kicks in. And you can see how steep that curve is at the beginning. And over time, you just forget more and more and more. And so this idea of retrieval practice is what we use to interrupt forgetting, to stop forgetting from happening. And to visualize this, we can look at this in terms of retrieving the knowledge from long-term memory through practice. And you can see here the forgetting curve is being changed. You can see the kind of the dotted line, which might represent what would happen if there was no practice. So you can see the forgetting kind of tapers out pretty quickly. And what you might also notice there is that gradually the practice gets further and further away. So this is about spacing out the practice, and the science has shown that when you space out the practice, the encoding into long-term memory is a lot richer and a lot deeper. So what we have here is giving the students the opportunity to practice something in slightly longer periods of time. I noticed your comment here, Cassandra. I just wanted to check this. This is a difficult thing to control in theoretically, the ongoing practice and the interruption forgetting is happening in the workplace. Yeah, good point. That absolutely, workplace practice may be a part of the practice activity. Of course, when we do this, it can be difficult to control, but I think that could certainly be part of the mix of how we achieve this spaced practice and retrieval practice. And the final one is varied practice. And this started out with the beanbag toss experiment, where they got the kids and they kind of had a control group who just practiced throwing the beanbag in, you know, that little beanbag toss game. And they just practiced the same distance. You know, they were the same distance from the thing. They just practice, practice, practice. And the other group, they got them to vary their practice in different distances. And then they tested who was the more accurate at throwing the beanbag. And it was the ones that had actually had the varied practice. And they've tried this out in a number of different times with different types of skills and cognitive learning and knowledge-based learning. So it works pretty well. So that's, I think the main lesson here is not just practicing the same thing over and over again, but practicing it in different ways, using the skills in different ways. And I think a really great example, has anyone had a go of Duolingo before in learning a language? I think it really captures some of these concepts very, very well. If you haven't had a go at Duolingo, you can try it for free. There's a couple of ads and things in there's probably a little bit annoying, but even if you're just a curious educator and you don't want to learn a language, I'd recommend getting the app and having a bit of a go with it. I'm well aware that Duolingo, now probably a very, very financially successful organization, has poured a lot of money into the research of how people learn, especially with learning languages. And I know learning languages is not the same as learning vocational skills, but it's a really good case study in applying these things. So retrieval practice. So almost everything in Duolingo is an activity. So for many of us, we kind of get caught up in doing stuff like this, long lectures and long learner guides. And it's kind of like, we're going to pour all of our energy into teaching the subject, and then we're going to do a test. Whereas Duolingo, almost everything is an activity. They sometimes have a little bit of a screen where you might go and review some vocabulary and kind of scroll through a couple of things, but it's very minimal and it's few and far between. Almost every lesson is actually a little quiz, an activity where you do stuff. So very interactive. It's spaced practice. So while it tries to encourage daily practice, you'll notice if you do it over a period of time, that they start to gradually increase the periods of time where they revise previously learnt words and grammar. So if you do it, let's say over a few months, when you get into month 3, you'll go, oh, gee, what was that? They'll suddenly pop up a word that you haven't seen in a long time. And then you have to really search your memory. I know we learned this. And then retrieving that from practice, having not done it for a while, it helps to really store that and encode that in long-term memory. Set the neural pathways, as someone said. So that is the spaced practice in action. And then varied practice. And I really like how they do this, because it's not just the same thing over and over again. I remember trying it out probably, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, and it was almost the same thing over and over again. But now they've really mixed it up. So now they've got a mix of speaking practice. We actually have to talk the words, and it kind of picks it up and figures out if you're saying it right. Listening practice, where you've got to listen to what they've said and sort of comprehend it. Translating terminology, little closed passages like in the picture here. The feedback's immediate. It's really good because it collects up your mistakes, and it kind of gives you special sessions based on things that you're really struggling with. So it really ticks a lot of boxes for the science of learning. So definitely check that out if you're curious, if you haven't seen it already. If you have, you'll know what I'm talking about. So I think here we're going to do a bit of sorry, I just want to see this. What Warren said. You said the WeChat app is good. I've just missed a screen here. Well, the WeChat app is very good because it has several languages you can choose depending on the country the learner's from. That's awesome. Thanks, Warren. Just get back to the screen here. So the next few graphics are from a book called Design for How People Learn. I'm a huge fan of this book. The author is Julie Dirksen. I've got a link to her stuff at the end. And I know if you've probably been in a couple of other sessions where I've talked about this. For anyone new though, this is really important stuff. So this captures what happens in most courses, but especially e-learning. You kind of have the set of modules, and it's intro, new stuff, more new stuff, even more new stuff, yet again with the new stuff. And then you're kind of exhausted by the time you get to the summary. And I guess the analogy here is like riding the bike up a hill. It's just hard yakka. It's just constantly new stuff. By the time you get to module 5 and module 6, you haven't really covered anything from module 1, 2, and 3 again. So it's not really that building. And as someone had mentioned earlier in the chat, there's no scaffolding there either. So what we want to try and aim for is, rather than this kind of picture, we want something that looks a bit more like this. So riding a bike is a lot more fun when you get to ride like that, rather than just up a hill the whole time. And so you can see here that Julie's tagged the bits of new information. I know this is just a simple analogy, but you start easy. You probably start by riding down a hill a little bit and you get the hang of it and you go, hey, this is fun. And then, whoa, okay, we've got a hill. We've got to ride up this hill. It's going to be tough, but I can see, it's not a huge hill and I can see the top and I know I can do this. And so there's some new stuff. And then we have a bit of fun going down the hill. And then, whoop, there's another hill, but I've done hills before. I know how to get up hills. And then you can see where we're going with this. And in practice, what does this mean for e-learning? I know there's a silly little picture of riding a bike up and down hills, but we can use things just like in Duolingo. We can use activities. We can experiment with case studies. We can use videos. We can use practice, workplace activities, applying discussions. There's all sorts of different tools and technologies that you can use to start to use this stuff to get people to apply the learning that they've achieved already. And another sciencey thing, I'll just touch on this briefly. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was a Russian researcher who came up with, I think he was, I probably should fact check that. Anyway, the flow concept. Mihai Csikszentmihalyi came up with this idea of flow, and it's kind of like the idea of keeping people in the zone. And you can see here, we've got an axis of challenge. So on the up and down axis, we've got high challenge, that's really hard, and low challenge at the bottom. It's really easy. And then skill level. So that's the progression of our learners' skills as they learn stuff. So their skills developing over time. And it goes from low skill to high skill. And you'll notice in that blue sort of arrow that says flow, it's kind of, that's like the sweet spot. So when you're designing your courses and you're introducing new stuff, we've got to be careful not to set the challenge too high, to go from, suddenly from low challenge to high challenge, because we get into the realm of learner anxiety. And what does this cause? This causes frustration, people get upset, and that's when you start to get people dropping out of the course. It's too hard. Sometimes that hits in really quickly. Students open up the course, they get into the first module or topic, and it's like, boom, this is too hard for me, I'm out, anxiety up. So what we can do is we can design our courses so that we very carefully introduce the level of challenge. But what happens on the other side of it is as people start to acquire skills, then we eventually get to the point where if we keep doing the same thing over and over, we're going to get bored. We're going to get into the boredom side of things there, which again causes frustration, it causes student dropouts and disengagement and all those kind of things as well. So we kind of end up with this constant interplay of tensions between anxiety and boredom, where we up the challenge and allow for the skill development to occur. And then we kind of get this undulating slowly up and down. And it kind of starts to look a bit like the bicycle going up the hill. So that's flow theory. Recommend looking that up if you're curious. Now, putting this all into practice will require some kind of documentation. So when you're putting together an e-learning course, you need to create a bit of a plan. And I'm going to share with you a template that you can use, or a bit of a structure that might be useful. And it's pretty similar. I mean, if you've done any kind of lesson planning, you've probably seen things like this before. And an e-learning plan isn't too much different. So you've got on the left-hand side there, timing. So how long are they going to spend on a certain thing? What the objective is, what the method of learning that objective is, and what tools and resources they can use to achieve that objective. There's a few little guidance notes there. And so if you want to sort of equate that back to the diagram we had of the bicycle, this is it kind of flipped on its side. You can start to you can go through and you can check your plan before you go out and start designing all this stuff. Because, making videos and designing modules and e-learning and doing all that stuff, the technical stuff, that's pretty hard work. And so doing a bit of a plan, first of all, will make sure that you have got the right plan and the right design before you go and invest all that time and energy. And so you can see the undulating bicycle picture here on its side, and you want to try and make sure that your schedule matches that up and down kind of structure. I'm really loving the chat as well. Thank you for everyone who's sharing ideas and communicating with each other. That's beautiful. Keep doing that, because this is, one part of this is me harping on and talking, but you can always watch the video. I love that you all connect and share ideas in the chat. That's very valuable. Another model too I thought I'd share is a friend and colleague, Catherine McGilvray of ELES. They're an e-learning development firm. They do a lot of really big stuff now. They have this kind of planning model where they kindly shared this with us, which is basically a way of more of structuring out your content. What your content's going to involve, and whether you're going to do, what information you're going to put on the slide, whether there's going to be a document download, whether there's a learning activity or a video. So that might be another way that you would like to plan it out as well, if you like that kind of thing. Now, I give you these pictures here of the templates and that sort of thing, but I really need to caution you that, you use your templates last. I think templates are a way of documenting stuff so that you can communicate it with your team. And especially if you're designing a bigger course, you might be involving other people in the development. You might be getting some people to make videos and some people to make PowerPoints, some people to put stuff in the quiz or in the LMS or whatever. So I think e-learning development needs to look a bit more like this picture, where you're brainstorming. Maybe it's on a whiteboard, or maybe it's digital like this other picture here, where you're getting ideas together and you kind of want that creative chaos happening. It's really important that you generate your ideas in the freedom away from templates and things like that, and just use your templates for documentation. I think templates stifle creativity. They're really good for students, to do assignments and things like that. But when it comes to actually designing a course, start with something like this, then get it into a template. And I think this is a really important quote. Don't lose focus of the learning journey by over-prioritizing content creation. I've got to catch myself on this one too, because sometimes I get so caught up in the content stuff. I'm really having a great time developing the content, and I lose sight of the big picture, of the learning journey, of the bicycle going up and down the hills, of the main plan. So always review back to your plan. Always think about your learning objectives, and always think about the student's journey that they're going to go on when they do the course. The KISS method works well, Bill. Thanks for that. Great. Now, what tech skills does an e-learning designer need to have? So this is an opportunity for you if you are into developing, if you're developing e-learning courses or you're thinking of getting into it. These are things that you need to consider maybe developing or taking stock of if you already have them. These are generalized here, but I'll show you a little quiz in a little bit that you can use to maybe take stock of where your strengths are and maybe where you need to develop. So some of the main skills people need to have for e-learning developing is HTML. So you don't need to be a coding person. And there's many tools now that are basically no code. But I can tell you that if you have a little bit of an understanding of HTML, you can actually perform some real power moves, some real e-learning kung fu. So it's well worth digging into that if you're a bit of a techie person, but not essential. Basic image editing, understanding, image sizing and ratios and all that kind of thing can be really good. The ability to learn how to learn. So, learning new software, learning how to troubleshoot. Because that's the thing with e-learning. You could go and do a course on all the digital tools, learn how to use a specific piece of software that makes a really good course, and that might be obsolete in a couple of years. So if someone's really going to get into e-learning, I think they need that ability to learn software on the go, be able to learn new tricks and new tools. Keyboard shortcuts, hacks, and workflows can be really helpful. File management, when you're designing an e-learning course, you end up with a huge bundle of files and documents and little pictures and images and things, and you need to learn how to organize them and manage them and not lose them. Basic visual design skills can be really good, and basic video editing, I think, has become a fundamental piece of the tech skill mix. Now, if you'd like to do a bit of a stock take on your skills, I've prepared this tech skills self-assessment. And just give me a quick moment. I will get that for you. I'll have my notes here. Just a moment, please. Here's my tech skills not in action right now. Here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to pop this in the chat here. So there's a link to my tech skills self-assessment form. So it's not particularly interactive, but it can be really helpful in just doing a bit of a stock take on your skills and coming to grips with any areas where you might need to develop, and also making note of things that you're doing really well. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment. My screen share has failed me. There we go. We're back up and running. And what you can do with this is when you're going through that little quiz, if you want to do it, I mean, you might already be pretty comfortable with your skills and that's fine. Go through and identify what your strengths are. Identify at least one area you'd like to improve on, and consider something, you know, the return on investment, because sometimes these skills take a little while to develop. So what's the one area that if you really maybe spend a bit more time developing that skill, it's going to have a huge payoff for you and for your students and for your development? And then you can think about what's best left to others. So there's some things that you just go, you know what, I never really want to learn HTML, or, you know, I just don't have the tools or the patience for editing video. That's something that I think is best left to others. So it's good to really think of it. You don't have to do everything. You can't do everything sometimes. So that's something to consider as well. Now we're on to the section. We're coming towards the end of our session today. Looks like we're coming in right on time. I knew there was a lot to cover in today's session. There's a lot to pack into it. Hopefully you've gotten some value from it. But here we are in the section on monitor, reviewing, and evaluate. And I think this is from Peter Drucker, you know, the old management guru here. If you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And I think the same is for e-learning, any kind of course development really, but we're talking about e-learning. So you need to be able to gauge the achievement of outcomes, and that will tell you whether or not you've actually, you know, achieved what you set out to do. Remember those 3 questions we said at the beginning, you know, who are your learners, what are the outcomes, and how are they going to achieve it? So did that actually work? Were the outcomes achieved? It'll give you valuable feedback on the quality of your course, and it'll also give you ideas on how to improve it. So when we are looking at ways to monitor e-learning progress, we want to be looking at the actual, if you can get a look at the students as they're moving through the course, and sometimes if it's a really hands-on course where you're interacting with your students on a regular basis, this will be a lot easier. But of course, in the realm of e-learning are those asynchronous courses where you don't have those regular actual meetings with students. So in these cases, you want to fall back on other tools to monitor progress. So some common ways that we might monitor our students' progress in a course is by looking at how they perform in live sessions, their responses to discussions, formative assessment tasks, your observation of them doing things, whether it be in the workplace or e-learning stuff, quizzes, activities, case studies, system reports, analytics. You know, a lot of learning management systems will give you that data. And of course, feedback from the students and you giving feedback to them as well. And what are some ways that we can review and evaluate as well? So that's more about looking at, okay, the course is finished, or, you know, the course is in full swing now. We want to see, have we actually achieved the outcomes? And we can do this by looking at the outcomes of the course, what units of competency were achieved, how students performed in quizzes and activities. Again, the LMS might give you reports and analytics. And when you're looking at the review and evaluation, look for patterns. You know, were there particular points, you know, is there data that might tell you, for example, that every time And we saw this, for example, in our old TAE course. We saw, wow, when students get to this part of the course, we can see the timeframes really start to spread out. We can see that we had to spend a lot more time trying to re-engage with learners when it got to this particular part of the course. For anyone curious, it was LLN, the LLN unit in the course. So we found that pattern there. So what that told us that perhaps the scaffolding was inappropriate, the support was inappropriate. Maybe we need to develop some more materials around that. Maybe we needed to give more opportunities for practice. Student and trainer feedback can be really good. So especially if you're the designer and there's another trainer running the course, talk to the other people that are doing the course as well. What did you find? You know, where were the students struggling? And of course, application on the job. You might remember the old Kirkpatrick 4 levels of evaluation. Reaction, did they like it? Learning, did they learn something? Behavior, did they actually apply what they learned? And then results. As a result of the student learning this stuff, are they actually kicking goals in the workplace? And if you can start to get to those last two of Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation, behavior and results, then you really know your course is working. So that's very important to go into that deep level. And if you're interested in another model, if you're sick of Kirkpatrick, Will Thalheimer's LTEM, which is the Learning Transfer Evaluation Model, is really good. There's a link to that there as well. So there's your reviewing and evaluation methods, a couple of ideas to get you thinking there. So what did we cover today? And don't go away because I'm going to share with you the resources. But what we covered today was the definition of e-learning. We had a chat about our own experiences as e-learners, which I think is very, very important because you need to put yourself in your students' shoes. And there was such a great contribution from you in the chat. I love that part of the session today. The e-learning protocols, so the rules of the game, you know, how important it is to establish the parameters of a course and giving really clear instructions to students. Designing your courses based on science. So we recapped on some science of learning. We acknowledged that, hey, e-learning is still learning. It's still human stuff. It's still people changing their skills and knowledge. We shared a template and some strategies for designing a course, and we looked at the structure of designing. We had a chat about the tech skills of e-learning designers, and then we just talked about the monitoring, reviewing, and evaluation of your e-learning and the importance of that. Now, the promised resources, I've got them here on the screen.